Do you hear that sound? Not the room around you? Not the faint hum of your devices, something deeper? A whisper that crawls under your skin, as if a voice from the earth itself has decided to speak. It tells you there are places in history where reason collapsed, where science stood helpless, and where silence was forced upon the truth. Tonight, you step into one of those places. The year was 1841, a small, cold town in Pennsylvania, where winter cut through the bones of its people, and candlelight barely held back the night. In a modest wooden home, a child was born, her name, Montgomery. By all appearances, she was ordinary, fragile even, but within months, something became clear. This was no ordinary child. Neighbors whispered of her eyes, wide, dark, almost knowing. They said when she looked at you, it was like being read not seen, but unmasked. Mothers clutched their rosaries. Fathers looked away. Infants cried when she was near. And when she turned to, the impossible began. Spoken sentences far beyond her years, quoting scripture she had never read, recounting details of places she had never visited. She described people long dead, events no one had told her, and secrets no child should have ever known. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others, terrified, claimed it was possession. But what terrified them most was that she was never wrong. Doctors were called. Ministers, too. They tried to explain her away, labeling her condition with names meant to calm their own fears. Unusual memory retention, they called it. Overhearing adult conversation. But the truth was darker. She spoke of histories before her time, rituals buried in church vaults, experiments conducted in basements that no villager admitted existed, and truths that bent the framework of reality itself. One night, at only 3 years old, Sarah recited an entire sequence of numbers, long, endless, ordered in ways no one in her village could comprehend. Years later, mathematicians would claim the same sequence formed the foundation of encryption systems that hadn't even been invented yet. The Montgomery family locked their doors. Neighbors grew restless. And then came the first disappearance. A local midwife, one who had spent hours observing Sarah, vanished without a trace. The only clue left behind was a scrap of parchment she had scribbled onto words that no one at the time understood. Living code. Science, the very tool we rely on to separate truth from madness, refused to touch her case again. Records of her examinations were sealed, burned, or vanished from archives. She was erased as if she never existed. But she did exist, and once you hear what happened next, you'll understand why her memory was meant to die. They said Sarah Montgomery was born in silence. No cries, no sound, no recognition of the world around her. Yet, from the very beginning, her eyes, those cold, unnatural eyes, seemed to pierce through everything. Neighbors whispered that she did not look at people the way children should. She did not search for warmth. She did not seek comfort. Instead, it was as though she was measuring, calculating, weighting her family, a God-fearing household in 1841 Virginia, believed her to be touched by something beyond the natural order. When she was only 2, Sarah could recite entire passages of scripture without ever being taught them. At 4, she spoke of events she should not have known, births, deaths, secrets hidden in the homes of her neighbors. The more she spoke, the more fear grew in the hearts of the community. People began to say she was not a child at all, but a vessel, something housing knowledge far older than her body. The local doctor tried to study her, hoping to expose her as a fraud, but every time he attempted to test her memory, Sarah did something that broke him further. She not only answered the questions before he finished asking, but she also revealed things about him, his affairs, his lies, his secret thoughts of self-destruction. He locked himself in his office for 3 days after his encounter with her. When he emerged, his hair had turned completely white. He never spoke of Sarah again, and yet, it was not simply her knowledge that disturbed those around her, it was her presence. Animals refused to go near her. Dogs barked until they collapsed from exhaustion. Horses reared when she passed by. Birds fell silent the moment she entered a room. Some said even the air itself grew heavy, as though it recognized the unnatural. But the most terrifying truth was this. Sarah herself seemed aware of her difference. She told her mother that she was not like the others. She said she could see the invisible chains wrapped around people's lives, the systems of control, the lies dressed as truth, the invisible cage of society. She claimed she could see the hands behind the curtain. And so, the question became unavoidable. Was Sarah Montgomery a child born with impossible gifts? Or was she something far more dangerous, an anomaly that exposed the hidden architecture of power? Because if a child could see through the illusion, how long before others began to see it too? But the story of Sarah Montgomery does not begin in the laboratory. It begins in the silence of her childhood home, where whispers filled the air like smoke, and where her mother claimed that Sarah often spoke of things no child could have known. Imagine a girl of 6 years describing the precise construction of a loom she had never seen, or recounting the battles of men who had lived 2 centuries earlier, not in fragments, but in full detail, names and dates aligned with historical records later confirmed. Her father dismissed it as imagination, a phase that would pass. But as she grew older, the patterns became undeniable. Her knowledge expanded, not like a child absorbing lessons, but like someone remembering what had always been there, waiting to be unlocked. By the time she was 12, she spoke of anatomy, of pressure points in the human body, of herbs that could calm the mind or silence it forever. These were not the words of a child. They were the words of someone far older, someone carrying memories too heavy for her small frame. Word spread. Local priests called it possession. Scholars whispered of genius. But behind closed doors, men in black coats came to the family farm, offering money, security, and silence in exchange for access to the girl. Her parents resisted at first, but poverty weakens defiance. Soon, Sarah was taken, not stolen, not kidnapped, but escorted under the seal of government protection. That was the last time her neighbors saw her. What awaited her was not education, but dissection, not of her body, but of her mind, locked away in institutions that claimed to protect fragile children. Sarah was subjected to endless tests. Doctors tracked her dreams, her pulse, the rhythm of her sleep. They forced her to draw, to write, to speak into strange machines that captured her voice on wire. Every word she gave them was catalogued, dissected, stripped of its humanity. She was no longer Sarah Montgomery, the child. She had become Subject 1841SM, a case file in a growing archive of anomalies the public would never know existed. And yet, despite the walls, despite the surveillance, Sarah found ways to slip messages through. Fragments of her voice survived, whispers in journals, coded notes hidden in the margins of reports. They reveal not madness, but warning. A warning to anyone who dared to uncover her fate. Because Sarah Montgomery did not vanish. She became something far more dangerous, a mirror reflecting back the truth about those who sought to control her. But Sarah's curse was not confined to her own flesh. It began to seep into the lives of those around her, spreading like a shadow from which no one could hide. Her parents, once respected among their neighbors, became pariahs. Whispers turned to accusations. Farmers muttered that their crops withered near her presence, that cows refused to give milk when she passed. One midwife swore that every child born within a mile of Sarah Montgomery was born sickly, or died within days. None of it could be proven, yet fear doesn't require proof. It requires only suggestion, only the cold weight of unease that creeps into a man's bones when he dares to wonder, what if it's true? The Montgomery family pleaded for help. They sought priests, physicians, and scholars. The priests came armed with holy water, their trembling voices cracking as they chanted psalms in a cottage that smelled of damp wood and sorrow. The water boiled on her skin, not with heat, but with a strange reaction no one could explain. Physicians arrived, quills scratching furiously as they recorded her every twitch, her every strange sound. They jabbed her with needles, burned her with candles, fed her tinctures that made her vomit black bile. Yet nothing silenced the storm inside her. Scholars brought books bound in cracked leather, speaking of psychical disturbances and magnetic disorders of the nervous system. None dared say the word aloud, but it hung unspoken in every room. One night, during a particularly violent episode, Sarah's voice was heard speaking in a language unknown to anyone present. Not the guttural tones of German, nor the sharp syllables of French, but something older, something primal. The words echoed with a rhythm that seemed almost too deliberate, as though they were not hers at all, but borrowed. The town's minister fled the house in terror, swearing she had spoken with the tongue of Babylon. From that night forward, no clergyman would enter their home again. And yet, despite all of this, Sarah lived on. Year after year, she endured, her body fragile yet unbroken, her mind fractured yet intact enough to watch the world recoil from her. Neighbors claimed her eyes glowed faintly at night. Others swore her shadow moved even when her body lay still. Parents forbade their children from playing near the Montgomery farm, warning them that to hear Sarah laugh was to invite madness into the home. Whether these were fabrications or truths hardly mattered. The damage was done. The child had become something more than human misfortune. She was now a vessel for something that should not exist in the world of men. And as the years passed, she would draw the attention of powers greater than any minister, any physician, any mortal man. But the real terror came not from what Sarah did, but from what she seemed to know. Witnesses claimed that she could answer questions before they were asked, repeat private conversations she had no way of overhearing, and speak of deaths in the village before they occurred. To the religious, this was evidence of possession, a child vessel for something unspeakable. To the curious few who called themselves men of science, it was an anomaly that needed to be measured, observed, dissected. And so, Sarah became less a child and more a specimen. She was paraded through candlelit halls and forced to demonstrate her talents before gatherings of scholars who scribbled notes with trembling hands. Yet, for all their intelligence, they could not control her. She would not obey their questions, only laugh, sing, and whisper words in languages no one had taught her. By 1843, rumors spread far beyond Montgomery Hollow. Officials whispered of her existence in closed chambers, asking whether such a child was a threat, or perhaps an asset. In those days, governments and secret orders were not blind to the usefulness of such anomalies. A child who could predict events, who could see into the hearts of men was not merely a curiosity. She was a weapon. And so, Sarah was taken from her family in the night. No one in Montgomery Hollow dared resist. Men in black coats led her away, her tiny figure swallowed by the fog, her laughter echoing down the road like a ghost. Where she was taken, no one knew. Some said to Philadelphia, where physicians of the college dissected her mind. Others swore she was locked in the basements of Washington, tested by men who served hidden masters. And yet, decades later, when those same men died and their diaries were opened, pages had been torn out, notes were destroyed, and the name Sarah Montgomery was nowhere to be found. Think about that. A child of flesh and blood, documented, seen, remembered by hundreds, was erased, scrubbed, not from memory, but from history itself. And when something is erased so carefully, so thoroughly, it is never by accident. It is because the truth it holds threatens everything we are told to believe about the limits of humanity, and about who controls that humanity. But there was something else. Something that made Sarah Montgomery more than just another poor child in the archives of history. Witnesses whispered that her eyes were different, not in color, but in weight. Men twice her age said they could not hold her gaze for long. Women claimed her stare made their skin prickle, as if their very thoughts were being stripped bare. And doctors, those priests of the scientific age, confessed off the record that when Sarah looked at them, it was not the look of a child. It was the look of someone who had lived 1,000 lives. They tested her, of course. At first, simple things, spelling numbers, reciting scripture. She could repeat entire passages after hearing them once, as if the words had been burned into her soul. She solved arithmetic not step by step, but instantly, as if the answer had been whispered into her ear from some invisible source. By the age of 7, she had surpassed her instructors in knowledge they had spent decades acquiring. By the age of 10, she had humiliated the greatest minds of Boston in a public demonstration, answering questions in Latin, Greek, and even Hebrew languages she had never been taught. And yet, it was not brilliance alone that unsettled them. It was her silence. Sarah rarely spoke unless prompted. She rarely asked questions, but when she did, they were not the questions of a child. They were sharp, cutting, designed to expose the cracks in the world around her. "Why do men believe their science explains everything?" she once asked a professor, "when they cannot even explain themselves?" The man laughed nervously, but later admitted he had not slept for 3 nights after. Hearing it, the whispers grew. Some called her a prodigy, a gift of God. Others muttered darker words, unnatural, unclean, possessed. She was no longer seen as a child, but as an anomaly, a threat, and in a world ruled by men terrified of what they cannot control, anomalies are never left untouched. There is a pattern, you see. Every era produces them children who do not fit, children who seem to carry secrets from another world, and every era tries to erase them. Sarah Montgomery was not the first, and she would not be the last. But the question that still echoes across centuries is this: did she know something the rest of us were forbidden to see? Or was she simply a mirror reflecting the corruption of those who studied her? The answer, perhaps, is the reason she vanished. Sarah Montgomery's body did not fail her, at least, not in the ways the doctors expected. Where a normal child might have succumbed to fever, her body burned hotter, as if fever itself strengthened her. Her skin seemed to resist cuts. Minor scrapes healed in half the time of other children. Some even claimed that when she bled, her blood was thicker, darker, as though it carried something ancient within it. Her behavior grew stranger. At night, when the house was still and the fire in the hearth had burned to embers, Sarah could be heard murmuring. Her mother thought it was sleep-talking until she pressed her ear to the door and realized Sarah wasn't speaking English. She wasn't speaking any language at all. Her voice dipped and rose in strange cadences, syllables that didn't belong to anything human. The sound was low, guttural, vibrating through the walls. And Mrs. Montgomery swore that at one point, she heard her daughter's voice answered by another from the shadows of the room. The neighbors were told that Sarah was ill with nerves, but gossip never needed much fuel. By the spring of 1842, everyone in town knew the Montgomery family housed something abnormal. Mothers crossed the street rather than let their children pass Sarah's window. Farmers refused to sell their freshest milk to the household, fearing contamination. It wasn't long before the whispers turned darker. Some said she was not truly her parents' child at all, but a changeling left by some inhuman hand. Her father began to keep records, a leather-bound notebook, still lost to time. Within it, he measured her pulse at different hours of the night, noted her strange behaviors, and drew sketches of markings that would rise faintly on her skin like bruises. The shapes were geometric, precise, as though drawn by some unseen hand within her blood. On the night of her 12th birthday, Sarah disappeared from her bed. The house was locked, her window sealed, yet by morning her bed was empty, the sheets cold, her breath no longer lingering in the air. When they found her hours later, she was in the field behind the house, standing barefoot in the snow, staring up at the sky with eyes that reflected the stars. She did not remember leaving her room. She said only one thing when her parents asked what she was doing outside: "I was called." And though they begged her to explain, Sarah would not say who or what had called her. By now, whispers of Sarah Montgomery's condition had grown louder than the church bells that rang through the village every Sunday. The local paper, the Evening Ledger, caught wind of the story. At first, they printed cautious lines: an unusual child, perhaps sickly, perhaps merely misunderstood. But once rumors began to circulate that Sarah never ate, never drank, and yet still lived, their coverage became bolder. Headlines screamed, "The child science cannot explain, and a miracle or a menace in our midst." Journalists arrived at the Montgomery farmhouse, their ink-stained fingers itching to pen accounts that would shock their readers. They described Sarah's pallor, her hollow cheeks, and her deep, unsettling eyes. They wrote of her silence, her refusal to interact, and her habit of watching people with a gaze that seemed older than the earth itself. And most importantly, they detailed the most troubling mystery. Sarah was wasting away, yet she had not died. No child should have survived such deprivation. No body should have endured. One article claimed she had been preserved by some divine force. Another implied she was possessed, a vessel of something not entirely human. This sensationalism sparked chaos. Curious townsfolk flocked to the Montgomery home, desperate to see the girl with their own eyes. Some arrived with prayers, convinced she was a living saint. Others brought holy water, determined to drive out what they believed to be a demon inside the farmhouse. Sarah sat silently, her small body trembling under the weight of every stare. The more people came, the more she shrank into herself. Her mother, Margaret, fought to shield her, but the crowd outside only grew bolder, pressing against the windows, knocking at the door, demanding proof. Then, one night, as if to confirm every rumor, something happened that even the Montgomery family could not deny. Neighbors swore they saw a strange glow emanating from Sarah's bedroom window, a dim, unnatural light that flickered like a lantern but cast no shadow. Some said it was the glow of heaven itself. Others swore it was hellfire. The next morning, Sarah spoke for the first time in weeks. She whispered a single phrase that her mother would never forget: "They're coming for me." Doctors in the early 1840s did not have the tools or knowledge we take for granted today. There were no MRI scans, no X-rays, no labs that could run complex tests. Physicians relied on observation, deduction, and whatever medical texts they could find, often outdated translations from Europe. In the case of Sarah Montgomery, this lack of modern instruments meant her condition remained not just unsolved, but a growing obsession for those who studied her. They tried every examination method available. They measured her pulse at intervals throughout the day. They charted the way her pupils responded to light. They pricked her skin to test sensitivity, but at times, she did not even flinch. Doctors placed small weights in her hands, observing that her muscles could carry them effortlessly, even when she had eaten nothing for days. And yet, when they asked her to describe her strength, Sarah always whispered the same thing: "It is not mine." Some physicians, frustrated and embarrassed by their inability to provide answers, declared her a fraud. They accused the Montgomery family of staging the illness, of feeding Sarah in secret while pretending she was surviving on air alone. But others, men of prestige and academic standing, argued that Sarah represented something entirely new. They published pamphlets, gave lectures, and described her as a phenomenon that science could not yet name. The Montgomery farmhouse, once quiet, became a pilgrimage site for both skeptics and believers. The family tried to shield Sarah from the constant intrusions. Curtains were drawn, doors locked, and strangers were turned away at the threshold. But curiosity in 1841 spread like wildfire, carried in whispers from taverns to churches. Those who saw Sarah claimed her presence was both magnetic and unsettling, as though the air around her vibrated differently. It wasn't simply that she defied excarnation, it was that she seemed to exist in a space between the natural and the forbidden. By late summer, tensions around her case reached a boiling point. Local ministers demanded that the family stop entertaining ungodly interest in the girl. Physicians urged further tests. Neighbors gossiped about witchcraft. And Sarah herself, pale and silent, only grew more distant from the world, as if each day she drifted further into an unseen place that no one could follow. The doctors, puzzled and increasingly desperate to preserve their reputations, tried something different. They invited men of faith to see Sarah. Their reasoning was simple. If science could not explain her, perhaps God could. Priests, ministers, and even a traveling preacher from New York gathered at her bedside. They prayed over her, sprinkled her with holy water, and read verses of scripture aloud, hoping to reveal either a blessing or a curse. But Sarah simply lay there, her thin chest rising and falling with eerie stillness, her lips occasionally twitching as though she wanted to whisper something no one was meant to hear. One minister declared her a living testimony of divine will. Another muttered that such unnatural slumber might be the devil's trickery. Yet none dared to stay in the room alone with her overnight, for even in prayer, the air felt thick, and some swore they heard faint whispers echoing from the walls as though the child's silence had created a void that something else had filled by this point. Rumors had spread far beyond her town. Newspapers published stories, each headline more dramatic than the last. Some called her the sleeping angel. Others called her the cursed child of 1841. Crowds began to gather outside the Montgomery home, and Sarah's parents, hopeful that someone might finally cure her, now realized that their daughter had become less of a patient and more of a spectacle. And that was when the first claims of visions began. Visitors reported strange dreams after seeing Sarah. Dreams filled with shadows, fires, and nameless figures standing at the edge of their beds. Sarah, it seemed, was no longer just a medical mystery. She was becoming something much darker, a mirror for the fears people dared not voice. As the months slipped into years, Sarah's legend only grew. She was now 16, though her body seemed frozen in the frail outline of an 11-year-old. Her hair had grown impossibly long, coiling down the sides of the bed like dark vines. Her skin, pale and unchanging, seemed to resist both age and decay. Doctors from Europe wrote letters begging to study her. A French physician described her case as a living death, a suspension of the natural order. He offered large sums to the Montgomery family for just a few drops of her blood. But her father, increasingly paranoid, refused. He believed the doctors wanted more than research. He whispered to neighbors that Sarah's body was a key perhaps to life everlasting, and that men of science would stop at nothing to unlock her. The house itself began to rot. The Montgomerys, once respected, grew poorer as they spent their savings keeping their daughter alive, or rather, keeping her from dying. Food was left at her bedside, though no one saw her eat. Her lips were sometimes wet, as if someone or something fed her when no one was watching at night. Passersby swore they saw a dim flicker of light through her bedroom window, even when no candles burned inside. A strange, bluish glow. Children dared each other to run up to the house, to knock on the door, to press their ears against the wood. Some came back trembling, saying they heard faint, breathless laughter that did not belong to anyone they knew. Now, Sarah was no longer seen as a girl at all. She was a symbol, a warning that there were boundaries man was never meant to cross. And her town, once proud to host curious visitors, began to whisper of curses. Livestock were found dead with no cause. A woman miscarried after visiting the Montgomery home. 2 men claimed to see a figure standing in Sarah's window, a shadow that didn't match her frail body. Still, she remained in her bed, silent, breathing, waiting. By the time Sarah Montgomery was 10 years old, her reputation had spread beyond Virginia. Doctors from Boston, Philadelphia, and even London arrived, eager to witness the child science couldn't explain. They expected a frail girl, perhaps delirious or prone to hysteria. Instead, they found Sarah calm, alert, and unnervingly composed for her age. These physicians conducted their own tests, each determined to prove her parents and neighbors exaggerators. They pricked her skin with pins, no reaction. They shined bright light into her pupils. Her eyes remained fixed, steady. They whispered secrets across the room, and somehow Sarah repeated them word for word, though she had no means of hearing. It was not only her endurance that stunned them, but her awareness, her inexplicable connection to things beyond her physical senses. Some scientists called it a miracle of the nervous system, an anomaly of biology. Others accused her parents of trickery, of staging performances to attract attention and donations. Yet, time after time, those theories crumbled. The girl's condition could not be fabricated. She truly lived outside the boundaries of what medical knowledge could explain. What disturbed observers most, however, was her composure. Children subjected to such tests usually cried or panicked. Sarah did not. She would sit silently, watching the doctors with eyes that seemed far older than her years, as though she understood more about them than they understood about her. Whispers of the supernatural began to rise again. If medicine could not explain her, perhaps religion, or darker. For some ministers debated whether she was blessed by God or marked by something unholy. Neighbors grew fearful. Some began avoiding the Montgomery household, claiming that even to look into Sarah's eyes for too long left them uneasy, as though she could see into their thoughts. And then came the night when Sarah reportedly spoke of a tragedy before it happened. A neighbor's barn caught fire at dawn, but Sarah had described the flames in detail the evening before. Skeptics brushed it off as coincidence, but in the days that followed, she would speak of deaths, illnesses, and accidents with uncanny accuracy. Sarah was no longer just a medical mystery. She was now seen as a prophet, a child, cursador, blessed with knowledge of things she should never have known, and that made her more dangerous in the eyes of both church and community. Sarah's condition was not confined to the privacy of her home. By 1842, curious townsfolk and outsiders began gathering outside the Montgomery residence, hoping for a glimpse of the girl whose story now spread like wildfire. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Whispered tales painted her as a saint touched by God. Others called her a curse born from something unholy. For every curious visitor who came to see her, the family's fear deepened. They had lost control of her story. Neighbors recalled nights when faint sounds, like chanting, carried across the fields from the Montgomery property. No one could prove it came from Sarah, but the timing was suspicious. Some swore her eyes glowed faintly when candlelight struck them just right. Others claimed her presence left the air heavy, almost suffocating. Yet when physicians visited, they wrote about nothing more than a child of fragile constitution with symptoms they could not categorize. One traveling doctor, a man named Dr. Isaac Howell, was particularly troubled. He described her in a letter. Her small frame belies a strength of spirit that defies natural explanation. When spoken to, her replies are not of a child's imagination, but of a matured philosopher, and at times, something darker. Howell begged for her to be moved to a proper facility where she could be observed, but the Montgomery family resisted. They feared exposing her further would bring ruin or worse, attract the church's wrath. It was not long before whispers of exorcism began. Ministers debated quietly, unsure if Sarah was a victim of sickness or the vessel of something unspeakable. But within her home, the truth was more unsettling. Sarah began speaking of places she had never seen, describing details of foreign lands with eerie precision. She spoke of Egypt's deserts, of Italian cathedrals, of wars and kings, long buried in history. When asked how she knew these things, her answer chilled everyone. They tell me. Who they were, no one dared ask. By 1845, Sarah was no longer just a child studied in secrecy. She was now a subject whispered about in the most prestigious medical circles. Letters circulated across Europe written in code, shared in confidence, speaking of the Montgomery child who could not be explained by anatomy, chemistry, or even the laws of nature. Doctors who came to see her left the Montgomery estate, shaken. Some claimed her skin carried faint markings that shifted like shadows under candlelight, as if her very body was rewriting itself. Others swore that when they tried to measure her pulse, the rhythm changed with their own heart beats, though she was mirroring them. Sarah, however, remained eerily silent during these examinations. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words chilled the room. Once, when asked what she remembered of her infancy, she whispered, "I remember before." When pressed further, she refused to explain. Behind closed doors, a physician from France confided to Samuel Montgomery that Sarah might be the bridge between worlds. He argued she was not diseased, but rather evolving into something humankind was not meant to understand. The Montgomerys, desperate for answers, gave permission for more invasive studies: blood drawn, hair analyzed, reflexes tested under strange conditions. Yet every result ended the same. Nothing matched human norms, but nothing proved supernatural either. Sarah was suspended between two realms, too human to be called otherworldly, too inexplicable to be called ordinary. And so the mystery deepened. Was she a glimpse into humanity's hidden potential, or an omen of something darker creeping into the world? In the winter of 1847, when Sarah was 14, the Montgomery estate experienced a night that became legend among the servants. The storm outside raged with such force that windows rattled in their frames, and the family gathered by the great fireplace for safety. Sarah, seated apart, stared into the flames with an expression no one could decipher. Then it began. The mirrors in the house, every one of them, started to hum. Servants swore they heard a vibration, low and metallic, echoing through the glass. When they looked closer, their reflections seemed distorted, as if the images staring back were not their own. One maid dropped her candle and screamed, claiming her reflection had smiled, though her real lips never moved. Samuel Montgomery rushed to cover the mirrors, but before he could, one cracked violently down the middle without being touched. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the halls. Sarah did not flinch. Instead, she whispered, "They are watching." Her words terrified the room. Who was watching? From where? Some thought she meant God, others the devil. But those closest to her swore she was speaking of something else, something that lived in the glass itself. After that night, most servants refused to remain in the house after dark. Samuel ordered the mirrors removed. Yet even then, guests whispered that the walls of the Montgomery estate sometimes reflected things they should not. Sarah seemed unaffected, but a trace of satisfaction lingered in her eyes, as if she knew more than she would ever reveal. It was clear now. Her presence was no longer just a curiosity, was a force changing the house, the family, and perhaps reality itself. By the spring of 1848, the Montgomery household had grown silent, not out of peace, but fear. Servants walked lightly, avoiding the east wing, where Sarah kept to herself. Whispers spread that when she was alone, she no longer spoke to herself, as children sometimes do. She spoke to someone. One night, a maid carrying linens paused outside Sarah's chamber. She heard two voices, one, Sarah's, quiet and deliberate, and another that was low, guttural, and distinctly not human. The maid dropped the linens and fled without a word. The next day, she begged to be dismissed, claiming she would rather live in poverty than remain one more night. But it wasn't only the servants. Samuel himself began to hear strange things. At first, it was faint scratching in the walls, like rats. Then came whispers his name, spoken softly in the dead of night. He tore through the panels, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Yet every time Sarah was awake, sitting at her window, smiling faintly at the storm clouds beyond, the family began to avoid her. But avoidance wasn't enough. Strange accidents unfolded with increasing frequency. Lamps shattered, doors locked themselves, portraits fell from the walls, as if pushed by unseen hands. Each time, Sarah was present, never startled, never afraid, only watching it. Was then Samuel confessed in private to his wife Margaret that he feared their daughter was no longer their own. He used words he had once mocked: possession, curse, damned. But Margaret, torn between faith and a mother's love, could not bear to admit what her eyes already knew. Still, every night, the voice in the walls grew louder, and Sarah's voice grew darker. By the mid-1840s, Sarah Montgomery had become less of a child in the eyes of those around her and more of a phenomenon. She was still frail, her growth slowed, her body stunted by years of unexplained illness. Yet her mind seemed untouched, sharp, aware, and deeply observant. People often remarked that she spoke with the maturity of someone far beyond her years, as though the suffering she endured had opened some hidden chamber of wisdom. To others, this maturity was not a gift, it was unnatural. How could a girl so physically diminished still command such presence? The villagers whispered of possession, divine punishment, or a curse placed upon her family. Her mother defended her relentlessly, calling her daughter's endurance a miracle. But behind closed doors, even she wondered whether something unseen was truly at work. Doctors continued their visits, each one hoping to succeed where others had failed. Treatments grew increasingly desperate. Some attempted strange diets of raw vegetables, bitter herbs, and tinctures of opium. Others tried to draw out what they believed was bad blood through painful leeches and incisions. None of it made Sarah bear. Instead, each intervention seemed only to weaken her further. Yet she did not die. No matter how far her body deteriorated, she clung to life. This confounded everyone who witnessed it, and gradually, her survival became more unnerving than her illness. For a community bound by religious conviction, there could be no middle ground. Sarah was either chosen by God or marked by the devil. As years passed, her name traveled beyond the county. Newspapers picked up the story, describing her as the child science could not explain. These reports exaggerated her symptoms, painting her as a skeletal wraith who neither ate nor drank. A child sustained by forces not of this world. Families from miles away came to gawk at her, some out of pity, others to prove to themselves that the strange reports were true. Sarah herself grew weary of their stares. She told her mother that she could feel their fear pressing down on her, like invisible chains. And though she could not walk unaided, her words carried the weight of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, and understood too much for a girl of her age. It was in this period that the first claims of the supernatural began to swirl. Some visitors swore they saw her skin glow faintly under candlelight. Others said they heard voices whispering near her bed when no one else was present. Whether these were the inventions of overactive minds, or something far more sinister, they only added fuel to the growing legend of Sarah Montgomery, the girl caught between the natural and the unexplainable. By the summer of 1844, Sarah's life was no longer her own. Every moment was scrutinized, every glance measured, every breath interpreted as a sign. Neighbors, once sympathetic, now looked at her with wary eyes, whispering behind curtains and muttering as she passed by. For them, Sarah had transformed from a child into an omen, something to be feared rather than pitied. The Montgomery home became a place of pilgrimage. Strangers from neighboring towns, hearing of the girl the doctors could not explain, would travel to see her with their own eyes. Some arrived with curiosity, others with holy water, and a few with ill intent, convinced she was a danger to their own families. Elizabeth fought them at the door, her voice cracking with exhaustion, but the crowds did not relent. Inside the home, Sarah's world shrank. Her bed became both her prison and her stage. She was forced to endure the stares of men who debated whether she should be studied or confined, priests who argued over whether she was chosen or cursed, and women who silently wept, unable to understand how such a fragile child could carry so heavy a fate. Sarah herself rarely spoke. When she did, Her words carried an eerie weight, as though she were speaking truths no child should know. The doctors who had once promised explanations now grew frustrated. Their examinations became harsher, their patience thinner. They forced her through endless trials, measuring, prodding, recording every flicker of her body, as though she were an object, not a human being. Elizabeth begged them to stop, but poverty left her powerless. Without their coin, the Montgomery family could not survive. It was during one such examination that Sarah startled even the most hardened of physicians. Her pulse stopped, not slowed, not weakened, but stopped entirely. For several minutes, her body was cold, unresponsive, as though life had abandoned her. The doctors declared her gone. Elizabeth screamed, collapsing to the floor. But then, without warning, Sarah's chest rose. Her eyes opened. She whispered a single sentence none of them would forget. "I have seen the place where none return." The room fell silent. Hardened men trembled. One doctor vomited in the corner. From that day forward, their notes no longer read like medical records, but confessions, admissions, that they had glimpsed something they could neither explain nor endure. Sarah, barely 12 years old, had become something more than human in their eyes, and with each passing day, her condition drew her further from the world of the living, closer to a realm no one could follow. But perhaps the most terrifying element of Sarah's story was the silence that surrounded it. The newspapers, so eager to cover scandals, crimes, and tragedies of the 1800s, seemed oddly reluctant when it came to Sarah Montgomery. A few small-town presses printed articles, often buried in the back pages, reporting on the peculiar child of Hamilton County, but larger city papers either dismissed the accounts or failed to mention them altogether. Some historians argue this was deliberate. By the 1840s, America was striving to appear modern, rational, and grounded in Enlightenment ideals. A story, like Sarah's one, that seemed to defy all logic was inconvenient. It threatened the image of a nation progressing toward science and reason. To give her case too much attention would be to admit that mystery still lingered in the shadows. Her family, meanwhile, became reclusive. Visitors who once came from miles around began to be turned away. Sarah was kept indoors more frequently. Some say this was to protect her from prying eyes. Others whispered that her behavior had grown even stranger, that objects in the home would move of their own accord, that neighbors claimed to see lights flickering in the upstairs windows long after the lamps had been extinguished. By 1845, 4 years after her birth, Sarah Montgomery had become less of a child and more of a legend, whispered about in hushed tones. Parents warned their children not to stray near the Montgomery home. Pastors invoked her name in sermons about sin and divine punishment, and yet no one could fully explain her. Science failed. Religion faltered. Even folklore seemed to strain under the weight of her existence. It is in this silence, this refusal to speak too loudly, that the true horror resides, because what people will not say is often far more terrifying than what they will. And Sarah, she grew older, but she never grew ordinary. The more one investigates the story of Sarah Montgomery, the more one realizes that her existence itself posed a question to the very foundations of 19th-century belief. On one side, doctors of the period armed with little more than crude instruments and an incomplete understanding of the human body were left bewildered by her condition. On the other, clergymen saw her as evidence of divine intervention, or worse, of demonic trickery. The townsfolk whispered in corners, unable to decide whether Sarah was a miracle or a curse. What made it all the more chilling was the fact that Sarah seemed aware of the unease she caused. Witnesses described her piercing gaze as older than the mountains, claiming that when she looked at someone, it was as though she were reading their innermost thoughts. Parents pulled their children away, not wanting them to fall under her influence. Farmers crossed themselves when she passed, and yet, despite the fear, no one could look away for long. She was at once terrifying and magnetic, a contradiction. Science could not chart, and religion could not contain. The deeper the mystery, the darker the implications. Was she a glimpse into some forgotten truth about human potential? Or was she a warning of what happens when knowledge dares to trespass into forbidden territory? By the late 1830s, Sarah Montgomery's notoriety had grown beyond the confines of her small Virginia town. Scholars and physicians traveled from distant cities, Richmond, Philadelphia, even Boston, just to witness her strange condition firsthand. Many returned unsettled, their medical notes contradicting their own training. One surgeon described her heartbeat as erratic, as though timed to some rhythm outside human comprehension. Another swore she did not bleed in a natural manner, claiming that when her skin was pricked, the blood seeped out thick, almost tar-like, before returning to a normal red flow moments later. These accounts never made their way into official journals. They circulated instead as whispered rumors in private letters and closed societies. The silence was deliberate, for to publish such findings would invite ridicule, or worsen inquisition into what they had uncovered. Meanwhile, the clergy took more drastic measures. A minister claimed Sarah's presence was tied to the crumbling foundation of his church, where crosses would topple unexpectedly during sermons. Another spoke of hearing her voice in his dreams, even though he swore he had never spoken to her. The contradictions mounted. She was fragile, yet enduring, cursed yet preserved, human, yet somehow beyond humanity. Those who encountered her left convinced of one thing: Sarah Montgomery was not merely an oddity, she was an omen. By 1840, the pressure to contain Sarah Montgomery had reached a breaking point. Her very existence had become a battlefield between factions: clergy, physicians, townsfolk, and a handful of secretive men who seemed to operate outside any known authority. That year, an incident occurred which would seal her fate in local memory forever. One autumn night, the townspeople awoke to screams echoing from the Montgomery house. Witnesses claimed they saw a pale glow radiating from the windows, as if the entire structure had been set aflame without burning. When the neighbors rushed inside, they found Sarah collapsed on the floor, her body convulsing, her eyes wide open, yet rolled back as if staring into another world. The physician on duty declared it a seizure, but others whispered something far darker, that she was being claimed. Even more disturbing was what lay beneath her. The floorboards had buckled and split open, revealing a narrow cavity filled with blackened water that smelled of decay. No such cavity had ever been recorded in the house before, and when they searched it the next morning, it had vanished entirely, leaving the floor intact. That night marked the beginning of the town's decline. Crops withered early, animals grew restless, and families began to abandon their homes. Too many. The connection was undeniable. Sarah was no longer just cursed. She was the vessel of something unholy. The year after the glowing floor incident, the whispers about Sarah reached ears beyond Virginia. A discreet group of men, traveling under false names, arrived in the town in the winter of 1841. They did not call themselves a society, nor did they announce their purpose, but their movements carried a precision that betrayed military or ecclesiastical training. They came armed, not with weapons, but with heavy trunks of manuscripts, instruments of measurement, and strange relics wrapped in black cloth. The locals quickly recognized that these men were not here to treat Sarah as a patient. They were here to contain her. For weeks they visited the Montgomery estate at night, forbidding anyone else to enter. Witnesses said they traced symbols in chalk across the doors and buried iron stakes in the earth around the property, muttering prayers in languages no one understood. Rumors spread that these men belonged to a network older than the Republic itself, tasked with managing forces that polite society pretended did not exist. Their conclusion about Sarah was never formally written down, but the effect was clear. She was declared not human in the ordinary sense. The townspeople were warned quietly, firmly, and with the kind of authority that brooked no argument, that she must never leave the house again. From that moment forward, the Montgomery home was less a residence and more a prison. Its windows shuttered, its garden overgrown, and its occupant unseen by the living world. By the mid-1840s, Sarah had become less a person than a rumor and unspoken warning that lingered in the hearts of the townspeople. No one saw her in daylight anymore. The few who claimed to glimpse her through a curtain swore her face bore little resemblance to the girl they remembered. Her eyes, they said, reflected light like an animal's, even in the dark. Her skin had grown almost translucent, the veins beneath shifting and branching as though they were alive. The men who had come to contain her returned each year, always under different names, as though to ensure she was still confined. They carried with them candles that burned with unnatural smoke and iron-bound books that should not have existed in this country at that time. Some believed Sarah was no longer aging as others did, that she had slipped free from time itself. Yet others whispered she was rotting from the inside, her body a vessel stretched far beyond what the human form could endure. Her cries were seldom heard by then, but when they did emerge, they came in long, mournful tones, so deep they rattled the glass in the nearest farmhouse windows. They said her voice was no longer fully her own, it carried an echo, as if two beings spoke from her throat at once. Mothers warned their children never to wander near the Montgomery estate. Even animals avoided the property. Dogs howled if led too close, and birds refused to nest in its trees. It was as though the land itself recoiled from what lived inside. By the time the century neared its end, a terrible realization spread through the town. Sarah's suffering might not end with her death. Whispers claimed that whatever force had taken root in her would not perish, but instead would seep into the soil, the air, and the blood of those nearby. The Montgomery estate, once a proud manor, had grown crooked and decayed, the roof sagging, like a spine bent beneath invisible weight. Yet despite its ruin, no one dared to tear it down. Some believed the house itself had become a container, a fragile prison holding the things Sarah had become. A handful of reckless boys, curious in the way only youth can be, once crept too close and pressed their ears against the rotted walls. What they heard sent one of them into a faint and left another mute for the rest of his life. The third boy spoke of what he heard only once, a woman's voice, low and slow, humming a lullaby. But he said beneath that melody was a second sound, something vast and ancient, breathing in rhythm with her song. The families of the town began to fear their children would inherit this curse if the cycle was not broken. They spoke of strange illnesses that appeared only in those who lived closest to the Montgomery land, children born with odd marks on their skin, voices that matured too quickly, and dreams that left them screaming into the night. Many fled westward, abandoning everything rather than risk their bloodline being touched by the darkness. Those who remained lived as though under a shadow, convinced the curse was patient, waiting to outlive them all. Even now, more than a century later, the Montgomery land remains abandoned, fenced off by rusted iron that no living owner dares to claim. Developers have tried to purchase it, only to withdraw, without explanation, after walking the soil. Paranormal investigators have set up cameras, yet their footage either vanishes or reappears corrupted, filled with static and a faint, rhythmic humming that grows louder the longer one listens. Locals warn outsiders not to linger there, not because of superstition, but because of what has been quietly documented: visitors complaining of pressure in their chest, a coldness in their blood, and vivid dreams of a woman standing in the shadows, her eyes burning with something that is not entirely human. Old families in the area still whisper that Sarah's voice has never stopped. It threads itself into the air on certain nights, reaching across the years, searching for someone who will listen long enough to let her in. And so the story of Sarah Montgomery has become less of a tale and more of a warning that some fates do not end with death, that some bonds between flesh and darkness are never broken. If you ever find yourself near that forgotten estate, and you hear a lullaby where no mother sings, do not stop to listen. Walk away quickly, and do not look back, for those who do are said to vanish, their names never spoken again, as though they had never lived at all.